As always, before we get into our conversation, it's important to us, to both Craig and myself, that we acknowledge if we were at SAIT's campus, and we are both based in Calgary as well, so it's still highly relevant, that we are situated on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy. So today that encompasses the Indigenous people of the Treaty 7 region, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda, and the Northwest Métis homeland. SAIT also acknowledges all the people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. This traditional land is a place where we all walk in the footprints of the Métis people.
Thanks, Jenny. You always do such a good job of that. And Tanya, thanks for the note. I just saw a note there from Tanya that some folks had to re-register when they clicked on the link this morning. So I'm curious as to what that's about, but I guess there's always going to be Zoom gremlins, things that we now have to deal with, which is interesting enough. So this morning, what is September going to look like? And the reason I brought this one up with Jenny is that, you know, we're heading into the last couple of weeks of summer here. Lots of us are starting to think about, I'm going to be taking some vacation time. And then September becomes a really interesting period, right? I've got 2 kids returning to post-secondary, both vaccinated. Who knows what other students are going to be like at post-secondary. We're moving one to Edmonton, which will be a big uprooting in our life. It's only 3 hours away, so it's not too bad. It's not Fredericton. You know, we're dealing with our own reopening at SAIT and whether we're going to be back on campus or hybrid, or if I'm speaking for employees as well. You know, there's uncertainty about work arrangements, uncertainty about the next phase of the pandemic, especially timely today when it would sound like the province is ready to backtrack on some things that we will hear about this morning. And so I'm not sure in my entire career that I've ever dealt with so much uncertainty at one single moment in time. We've always dealt with ambiguity and uncertainty, but holy crow, there's a lot packed into the next few weeks. I think now until the end of September is going to be an incredibly dynamic and stressful, anxious time for leaders. And so I wanted to have a conversation with Jenny around that. And, you know, I encourage you, if you have some of the same concerns, anxieties and so on, please do throw them in the chat or pose your questions. But for me, and then when I mentioned it to Jenny, she said, you know, Craig, this is all about developing the right mindset for the fall. So why don't we start there, Jenny?
You are here. And for most of us, I think that you are here perhaps feels a bit more like this at the moment. So yes, it's busy, it's ambiguous, it's uncertain, it's all happening. And we hear the acronym on the left, we hear a lot. It makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck when I hear people say VUCA. It's so negative. And you brought up a point there, Craig. We've actually been here in various forms before. It just feels like this one is heightened. And so when you think about as a parent, you've had VUCA times. When you think about in your career, you've probably had times like this before. But it just seems that everything is piling on at the moment. And then the second piece, I like this one. This is what they call a paid reality. And I think the gentleman who created it was called Rasmus Hangard. I think it might be that's who it's attributed. And this one's a little bit more realistic because we are under pressure. We always have to be on. It doesn't matter whether you're on camera with Zoom or you're achieving deadlines or whichever piece, it's constantly on, and social media doesn't help that. We have an information overload. Just imagine how many emails are coming in right now while you're here. There's going to be a long list for you when you're done. And we're constantly distracted. And so as we set in, we know it's difficult. And I think one of the biggest pieces that we can all remember as we sort of start looking at September is just to stop. And, you know, when we went home, we were sent home. We didn't have a choice. We were chasing, we were running, we were trying to make it work. How can we survive? It was all about survive. And Mark Goulston, he said it best. There's a ton of noise in your head. So as you think about all those things, you have a child moving, you're going back to work, your employees are coming back uncertain, etc. And then there's a ton of noise in your world. The government keeps changing the restrictions, state might change their mind, etc. In between those two noises, there's a great space. And actually, maybe what we need to do a little bit more is just stop and find that space occasionally. And that allows us to do that reset. So what if VUCA actually meant? What are we looking at? How do we best understand it? Let's get some clarity around that. And if we've proved anything in the last 16 months, we can flex a little bit. We can be agile in this place. It still works. We're still here. We're still running. I shouldn't say running. I just said stop running. We're still doing. So maybe it is about that sort of mindset and that reset a little bit.
100%. And, you know, what you said about still running, you know, if you think back to March 16th of last year, when basically we all started in this, this scenario, if you had said we're still going to be sitting here in some way, shape or form, August 13th, a year and a bit later, I don't think many folks would have believed that, but we have, and we've survived, and in some cases thrived, and we've adapted and we've moved forward. I'm going to pause quickly because I know there's been a number of other folks that have joined us since we started talking. So thank you, welcome. Again, I'll be monitoring the Q&A, and if you've got comments, concerns, questions, thoughts about this whole next 6 weeks, and what are you concerned about as a leader, taking your team through this next period? Maybe some of you are there already and it's working, and would love to hear that as well. The other thing that you just talked about there, Jenny, is that, I shared my story, real short portion of it. That's one story, right? And as a leader, you've got an entire team of stories that you have to be able to read and manage. I'm sorry to carry on the analogy, right? But for me, that is probably one of the toughest things any leader has to manage in their day-to-day is, what are the stories that are going on my team? Because each one of us has had a different experience with this pandemic. Each one of us is going to have a different experience with this next phase. To your point, yeah, we were sent home. It's not like we all went away and, got to play in some magical place for the last 18 months. We didn't have a choice. And so, I think, the stopping is an interesting one. I've got an acronym this time that you just made me think of, and it's called PAIR, right? Pause, take a deep breath. What's going on? How are you reacting? How are you feeling? Assess the situation, right? Reflect on what's working, what's not working. Pick the next 2 or 3 things that you really want to focus on, and then execute. So pause, assess, reflect, execute. I wish I could take full credit for that one. I've got a good friend that has that. So, what is your advice then for leaders kind of looking into the next 6 weeks? Like, how do you, and, again, folks, if you're thinking this, feeling the same, like, how do you take a look at your own mindset to say, okay, this is going to be potentially a very stressful period for myself and my team. Where do I go from there?
So I think there's a couple of things here. First off, we're going to call this the acronym conversation because that was great. I like that one. I'm going to borrow it actually, and we're going to come up with more. So, how do you?
We do acronyms well at SAID. So.
How do you look at it? I think the foundational piece is you have to look at yourself first. Where am I at? Yeah. And in that, that requires that pause that you just spoke about. And as adults, we actually have a challenge in that place. So let's just take a minute with this challenge. This is fun. Some of you in here, I'm recognizing some of the names in the attendee list. You've seen this before. So pause before you go into the chat. But if you've never seen this next slide before, there's a number of letters that are going to come up. And in the chat, just pop the first sentence that you see. What is the first sentence that you see on this next slide? Let's bring it up here. Okay, there we go. So just pop it into the chat. It would help if I could see the chat, which I can't. There we go. What is the first sentence that you see? Beyond one word. There we go. We've got quite a few coming in here now. So we've got lots of opportunity is nowhere. I saw opportunities everywhere somewhere. Lots of opportunity. Opportunity is now here. There we go. And it moves too quick. Craig, the waterfall analogy was a really good one for that chat. But most of you who saw opportunity is nowhere, first of all, have now seen opportunity is now here. And there's also somebody said to me once in a classroom, Jenny, opportunities snow here. And I'm like, okay, we live in Calgary, we can take that one. And I didn't catch it was somebody put unity, and that's never come up before. I love that that popped up there, because that could be a really key thing for us to take as well. But the deal is here, as adults, we're not very good at looking at the positive side. And we need to be clear here, when we talk about positive, it's not sunshine, roses, and all this sparkly dust and stuff. It's really just that optimistic viewpoint. And so as you look at returning in September, if you're sitting in there, opportunity is nowhere, you're projecting that. And we had a tiny conversation about this yesterday, didn't we? What are you projecting? We're always projecting something. Even if we're not saying it out loud, we're projecting it. So take a peek at where's your mindset at yourself? Are you looking at this positively, or are you looking at this negatively? There's a bit of reality testing in there as well. And then the second piece for you, like you mentioned, that you're taking some holiday personally. If you haven't got any holiday coming up before the next madness, the next version happens, what can you do for yourself in that time? What do you need to set up for success? Because what we know is people need to be held. And I don't mean that in the physical piece, but we need our leaders. And so we have to have our own mindset set before we hit that madness. And there's a lot of pre-work and conversation we can do that will help that.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. It was interesting to see, like, there was, to your point, there was a very large skew to opportunity is nowhere versus now here. So I found that fascinating. Perhaps as a sign of, as we all get older, we start to get a little more cynical, maybe, who knows. But a few questions have popped up here, so I think we'll go on to that. Shar, I do want to say thank you to all the farmers and ranchers, because man, you guys have had a tough year. So I can appreciate that. Question from Vis: can you talk about how to build energy, engagement, enthusiasm with the team if you're not feeling it at this point? All right. How do you build that excitement and engagement within your team if, as a leader, you're not feeling it?
It's a thought-provoking question, because that's difficult, really. And so it comes back to, you have to look after yourself first. So think about energy. Energy, everybody always sort of leans to time management. Actually, it's our energy management. It's the energy that we show up with that makes a difference. And so where's your own energy coming from? If you've been working 16-hour days on Zoom, on Teams, in your little box of a room, and you haven't been getting the breaks, your energy is probably low. And so first off, take care of your own energy. So what can you do to help that? And, the first one that my husband and I always go, we need more sleep. We're dreadful on the sleep factor. Okay, so if we have more sleep, we'd have more energy. We know that. How can we take care of that? For some people, it's what we're eating. What's the analogy? You're eating fuel or food. And so, when we're a little bit down, we might reach for the easy piece, or, our greatest phrase for the last 18 months, support local. Let's eat out tonight. Okay, but it's not always the best idea that's going to help us. So what are you doing for your own energy? You control that. There's a few medical pieces where you don't get to control it, but most of us have control over our energy. The second piece within there is, how do you engage your team? My first question is, are you engaged? Because if you're not engaged, remember, we're projecting. If you don't love it, if you're not excited, please don't expect them to be. Okay, that's a really difficult connection. You've got to have that engagement yourself. So the sake of time, to cut it short, is look after you again. Look at yourself. What makes you smile? What makes you come alive? How can you do more of that? As you lift that, you'll find it easier to lift them.
Yeah, that's good. I think one other thing I would add there too is be honest and transparent with your team. Right? I know for me, I know I've had moments over the past 18 months where I've had to look at the the camera, which the team could then see me, and say, guys, I'm not feeling it today. This day sucks, or this week has been awful. Right? And people, it's not measureless company, but people appreciate the vulnerability and
it's huge. Yeah.
right. So
Yeah.
another question here. How do you recommend to best support staff who seem to be displaying burnout and a great deal of trauma from the events over the past several months, but refuse to take any time off?
Oof. So first off, connects back to something that you said, Craig. We have to recognize there's 101 stories out there. So making space, and I really enjoyed what you just said about being authentic, being vulnerable, is just let people have that space to say what's going on. The burnout piece is interesting, especially if they refuse to take time out. That much information means there's a really good conversation. What's stopping them from taking the time off? And that in itself is a conversation. It's hard to know without the context. Are they using work for something else? Is there another reason? Is there a financial piece that's come up? And some of that's their own private information. You're not going to get, nor should you get, everything. But there is the opening to provide that space and really listen. Is it pressure from work that's meaning that they feel they need to work all the time? And I think the other piece in this question, sort of the umbrella piece to it, is boundaries. And boundaries is self-care, and we're not very good at boundaries. And so what does that look like as we shift, or even from today? How can we set our boundaries better? But again, if you're a leader, you have to know your own and you have to model them. We're projecting. That's my phrase for the day, because if you say, yes, we'll only work till 5, I don't know who says that anymore, but and then you're sending emails at 8:30, that's not making sense. But the whole team doesn't have to have the same boundaries. We just have to have them and set them. And the problem is that gets uncomfortable in the conversation. But we have to have that conversation.
Yeah, because inevitably there's always something that comes up, and just the one email, can you please let me know, right? Or those type of things. Those always come around. And it takes some serious discipline to be able to enforce or reinforce or hold yourself accountable to your own boundaries and the boundaries that your team is setting. So that's an interesting one. There's a couple questions here that somewhat tie in with each other, I think. So I'll just take the first one here, and it's multiple parts here, but I think we've somewhat touched on it. How do you manage the different stories? People who are excited to come back. We haven't talked about that yet, right? There are folks out there who are excited and can't wait to get back into the office. People who are nervous, the differing expectations, people who have kids to want to take them to school, people who don't want to drive, expectations from the employer. So many things for a leader to manage.
Yes. And that's why it's good that we're having this conversation now. That we need to know that. We need to be having those conversations. So we create an awful lot of stories in our head. So it doesn't matter whether we're looking at our team or we're looking at ourselves, we're constantly running a narrative in our head. And that narrative leads us to stress, leads us to anxiety, builds these conversations. So make space to hear the concerns, hear the stories. And then I think we just need to provide that foundation. People want to be heard and understood. You may have a company policy that doesn't allow you to be flexible. So my concern might be that I've said goodbye to my daughter. She's gone to school every morning for the past 18 months. September's coming up. I don't want to lose that piece. And my company policy says, nope, you got to be right in here by 7:30 in the morning, and that's a set. So what can you, there's not much you can do. There's not much wiggle room in there, but by letting people talk about it, letting them recognize it and having them feel heard and understood, that's the held piece in leadership. You can't change that for them, but you can hear them and you can touch base. How's it going? This is different for you. How are you adjusting? How's your daughter adjusting? We have a daughter, be grateful when we've gone back to work and she gets the house to herself when we're back at school. So it's different in every case. Sometimes you might have the flexibility. Now that's another conversation. How does that work? So I think, how do you manage all the stories? It's making space. We've talked about a cadence of communication. We're right back there again. Are you talking to people? I came across yesterday, I don't remember where it was, but some questions to ask your team before whatever comes next. And they were things like, how have the past 18 months changed your relationship with work, with our organization? What's most important to you today? Like, these are questions that we don't often actually ask people often.
Yeah.
How have your needs and expectations changed? As a leader, it's really good for me to know that if your needs and your expectations have changed. I need to request that we don't set any meetings after 4:00 in the afternoon, because at 4:30, I'm out of here to go pick up my kids or whatever that piece may be. And then the last one, this really caught my eye. What support do you need to remain engaged and employed with us?
Ooh.
And that is a courageous conversation, because as a leader, I might not like the answer, but it might give me some really, really good insight too.
100%. It also may give you an answer that, you can't do anything about, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
on the other hand, that goes back to a theme that we've talked about before, and that is leaders, individual contributors always have a choice, right? Just because you're concerned about it and sharing the concern does not necessarily mean that those conditions will change, right? And that I think that sometimes has to be an expectations that's reinforced, right? As a leader, I'm happy to hear your concerns, right? But you have to know there might be some things that we cannot adjust. To your point, Shar, you make a really good point here. You can be a catalyst for change, for sure. Maybe you can try and help and change the company policy around it. That certainly is not going to happen overnight, right?
No.
And I think sometimes too, in these conversations, there is that whole timing expectation that you need to address, right? Because I'm raising the concerns today, depending on the size, shape, scope of your organization, you may have a company that can make a change in next week. Okay, folks, this is a new policy. Others, you may be 6, 9, 12 months before a policy change can happen. So as a leader, it's great to hear those concerns, but you also have to make sure you're reinforcing without necessarily dampening, without making it look like you don't care. That can be a tough line to balance, I think.
I'll throw in there too, that as a leader, it's worth, you may have to ask somebody this, because we don't always have that awareness, but where do you sit on certain lines? Like when you said some are excited to go back to work, I can't wait to physically be in a classroom. I love the Zoom room. There's some really good advantage, but I can't wait to have a room again with people where we can dig into conversation. Yep. And so for me, it's hard to understand the person who doesn't physically want to go back to work. But we have to remember, in 2019, not everybody loved going to work. Not everybody loved having the commute. And just because if you're a leader, here's the word, you think it should be this way. You've all heard me say this before, don't shit on people. It's not fair. And so, where do we need to give a little bit in that too? And so if there is any flexibility in there, sometimes just because it's not the way you would like to do it, does that mean it's not possible? And we have to give a little bit in there sometimes. That's difficult.
No, 100%. A couple more questions here, I think, that are somewhat tied together. This first bit more of a comment, but my concern is getting people back into the office. Almost all the people on my team have no desire to go back at all, and they won't even entertain the idea of popping in just for one day to see how it is. I'm worried getting people back in, even just a couple days, will be a struggle. And I think that's somewhat tied with this question here. And that is, what is the best way to support staff who are feeling reluctant, resistant to coming back, aside from forcing them, which is an interesting visual, but how can we be empathetic towards their feelings to coerce them to come back in? Sorry, that was an interesting,
the
word coerce there got me as well. So Nicole, this is a great question. And
it is.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure I'm gonna have to, what is it called? Confident humility. I'm not sure I know the answer to this. There's a couple of things that I think that are worth looking at. I'm curious to see what happens. We said at the beginning of this, we were sent home. So we had to make this work, and we had to find a way of doing it. I'm not convinced that once we've shifted, and who knows when that real shift will be, will everybody choose to work from home? So I think there's a bit of a shift within there. I think some people, I think I don't want to go back. Maybe I will, because it's going to be very different when half my team are in the workplace and half my team are at home. And there's that whole proximity bias conversation, which is a conversation for another day, but that's going to feel different. So it might be that as things shift, people may become more curious towards, okay, let's try this out. The other piece is, we have to be careful, because I want to say reset your mindset, but I don't want to, you don't want to cover something up, but there are some advantages in when we go there, we have that transition piece. And so people say, I don't want to drive to work. But I quite like that time between work and home in order to change my hats. Because then by the time I get home, I can leave whatever's happened in the day and I'm ready to be mum, wife, friend, whatever's coming in the evening. It's a really difficult one to work with. And the other key point, I think, is the difference between this, we're calling them pull conversations and push conversations. And so as a leader, you probably want to pull people in when their voice is really important. So we have to look at it differently. When do we need people in the office? And so if you're bringing me in just for a potluck lunch, and I despise potluck lunches, no, I don't want to come to the office. But if you're pulling me in for a conversation, a meeting where my voice is important, and I know that, so this couldn't be in an email, this wouldn't be as successful as a Teams conversation. Okay, now I might be a little bit more curious to come and do this piece. And so as leaders, if you have that flexibility to say, yes, you can be at home and I need you here at X, make sure that X is valuable contribution time. How are you going to use that time? And that's different for us. We've not really had to think about that before. No,
for sure. Variable contribution time. I like that phrase. That's good. All right. And I think something else you said there that just triggered a thought for me is the fact that, that last March, we had to make the shift to work from home for those of us in those positions that could be done remotely, right? We've done it now. And in most cases, a lot of organizations have proven that it can be done, right? So the question now is, why do we have to go back to doing it the old way? And there's certain juxtaposition in that, right? There's a lot of fallacy of sunk cost going on. Well, we've got the lease, we've got the space, we might as well use it. Why? Yeah, right? It doesn't matter, right? But it's also, and I do want to get to this one because I know we do have one slide on this one, because it's triggering. The next few weeks, I think, are going to be very triggering for a lot of folks around potentially some very, as we've talked about it, polarizing conversations, right? And as a leader, I think that's going to be some really difficult landscape to walk through, right? You're going to have folks who think we should be here, we shouldn't be here. You know, folks that are going to be excited to be here, hate being here. They're going to have folks that are, let's not get into vaccination as a political discussion, but it's going to come up, right? It's going to show up in the workplace. So thoughts on that. I know we do have some thoughts on this one, because this is an interest. This is probably, I think, where a lot of the conflict is going to show up in the next few weeks. Yeah, and we do. And I'm going to try something. As I'm looking at the slides that we did have, I'm thinking these need to go backwards. So we're going to try going backwards here for a moment. Let's just get it up and see if we can get in the right place. There we go. Okay. So just have to remember to go backwards on this. So those polarizing conversations. Vaccination is actually a really good sort of one to play with, because it's true. Although, and I don't know if there's anybody from HR out there who knows this, I have a feeling we can't actually ask somebody else if they're vaccinated or not. I'm not sure where the land lies on that one, but at some point it was mentioned. So what do we do? Whenever you're in a polarizing conversation, we're back to that sort of that
beach ball piece, we're going to see this differently. And are we okay with that? So I think that's one of the pieces there. And so my piece I always go to is when somebody sees something completely different to me, do I need to be stuck in my mindset? No, I have my opinion. I have knowledge based on that created that opinion. So how can I learn more about their perspective? Can we shift ourselves into that piece? We can only do that if we're willing to be present in the conversation, literally present right here, right now. And actually, difficult conversations are a whole lot less difficult if you're in the present. If you're based on what's already happened that caused that, or you're worried about the future, you're not present. So that's one piece. And the second is, can we employ that curiosity? It doesn't mean that I have to agree in the end, but I might just understand where they're coming from a little bit more. Because at the end of the day, we just have to respectfully be kind of side by side. In order to get there, we need to think about our mindset. Now, this is a big, busy slide, so I apologize, but transactional analysis is a piece that we talk about a lot when we're in the classroom, and it's all to do with the mindset. Now, as you look at this, that okay doesn't mean are you doing okay today. It's how I look at you. So Craig, if you and I are heading into a conversation, there's 4 different mindsets I can have in that conversation. Let's take the top left-hand box for a second. If I believe my opinion, information is right, my confidence in a great place, I'm okay, but I don't hold you in that same regard, our conversation is going to be slightly dishonest. And so often people sort of run in on that one like a steamroller. And so now I'm going in on that conversation, I'm going to put you down, you're not right, your opinion is not worthy. What do you mean you're not getting the vaccination? That's an I'm okay, you're not okay mindset. And so how do we get to that I'm okay, you're okay? And the piece in there is we don't have to agree. I just have to respect, as an adult, you have a viewpoint, you have a reason, and this is how you're showing up today.
Yeah, no, for sure. No need to say oops, Nicole. Of course, it is what it is. It's all good. Lots of great comments I see here from April, Sarah, Dean, Karen, and Tanya with respect to that whole vaccination status. I'll let the HR folks manage that one and take that at their respective companies. I'm certainly not here. We're not here to guide on that by any means. So I guess a couple other things that come to mind for me is this whole piece around, okay, we know what's ahead of us over the next little while. We've got these pieces that we've got to deal with. You talked about, as a leader, making sure you're focused on yourself, right? Yep. So, as a leader, what is the best way that I can kind of set myself up for a good day or a good conversation or a good meeting, right? Inevitably, we got to take each day one at a time, and you got to kind of go through that day one interaction at a time. So, being deliberate in your thinking around how to approach is probably a great strategy for getting through. But I'm just curious as to your thoughts there.
Yes, and funnily enough, I'm just going to look at the numbers here. I did do something on this because this is key as we go in there. I like what you said there too. Like one step at a time, and there's such value in that. We get caught up in the hailstorm that's going on, and actually the only way we're going to get through is one step at a time. So this little piece, I use this a lot when we're in mental toughness, but I bring it into other places as well, is setting yourself up for success. And so the first piece in there, we talked about flights earlier today. We popped Ben on one earlier this week. And in there, we're going to hear that advice again. We haven't heard it for a long time. When the oxygen masks drop, what do? You put it on yourself first before you help others. So in each situation, look after yourself. And there's, back to the acronyms, there's those great acronyms. HALT is hungry, angry, lonely, or late and tired. So if you're any one of those, you're probably not ready. What can you do to help that piece? The other one in there is toast, which I came across the other day. What was toast? Tired, overwhelmed, angry, sad, or triggered. That was the other one. So those are your acronyms in that space. And then we have another acronym that actually I like this for leaders, and I think you can use it as an individual contributor, and you can use it as a leader, and you can use it with your team as well. So how do you set yourself up for success? 4 things to do. Number 1 is know your role. So when we're sort of listening to different people's stories in this liminal experience, your role is to listen. It's not to solve it. It's not to suggest it. Your role simply is to listen. When you're looking at priorities and strategy, your role is much more of a leadership role. And then do your team understand their roles? We've played slightly different roles whilst we've been in this different patch. So do we need to realign them? Do we need to hear about them? There's a great exercise that we do that's just based on roles. How do you see your current role? Where do you see it going? And what do you need from your teammates to be able to do that more effectively? These are good conversations for us to be having. Conflict in the workplace, I forget the percentage, but largely created or happens because people don't understand their roles. They don't have role clarity. And for those particularly curious, you don't even need role clarity, you need role acceptance. Do I accept my role? Then you can perform it under pressure. So as a leader going in, what's my role in this conversation? What's my role in this meeting? What role am I playing? The intention piece speaks to something that you mentioned just a few minutes ago, Craig, and that's you set the intentions. Where are we going? We're going to come back on the run. What are we going to achieve in the first month, in the first 3 months? Set it and then talk about it. And when we know, even in a conversation, what's the intention of the conversation? If you want to go here and I want to go there, we're not in the same conversation. Bring them in so they're aligned. Maybe we have to have 2 conversations. This strengths piece is really interesting to me in that we don't monopolize on this enough. We spend our whole lives looking for weaknesses, which drain the life out of us, don't make us feel good. And then we wonder why we're tired. And so do you know your strength? In every situation you go into, you have a strength you can take with you that will help you. So if your strength is in people and you're heading into a difficult conversation, use that people strength. You have that ability, you have that relational energy, whatever that is. And as a leader, what are your team's strengths? They found new strengths in the last 16 to 18 months. And I find leaders are a little scared in asking that question, because if somebody says, Jenny, what's your strength? I'm going to tell you 3 of my strengths. And they might be different than the 3 strengths that you think of that I have or that you need me to use. Now, what are we going to do with this? Well, that's great, because if I can use 6 of them, I'm having a pretty easy day here, because when we work from our strengths, to go back to, I think it was Viz's question really early on here, when we work from our strengths, it's energizing. We do a really hard day's work and be on fire at the end of it.
Yeah.
When we're not doing something, it's not fun.
Sorry to interrupt. I might add one additional, if you're a leader and you're asking that question of your team, what have you discovered? What new strengths have you discovered about yourself over the past 18 months? How would you use them in your role today? If I said, go forward and just use them.
Brilliant. Yes. And if it's a strength, we like it. And so you're saying, how can you use that? How can you go forward and use it more? Great. Now I want to be a part of that.
Right.
So
I think the fear on the leader side there is somebody comes in with a totally new strength that you've never considered before, and now you're like, how the heck am I going to leverage this? Right. And so, put it on the individual to suggest where it could come from. If they've got the strength and they've been thriving using it, guaranteed they've been thinking about how they could do it at work.
Absolutely.
100%.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And then the last one, we talked about that a little bit more already, is, look after your energy every day. And if you're lacking in energy, your point earlier was great. I don't always show up at 100%. Okay, I'm at 50% today. How am I going to do this? What am I going to do with this? At 50%, where can I take my performance to? Be kind to yourself. We don't run at 100 every day. We can't.
No.
And so we have to just sort of acknowledge that and put that in there. But the energy you enter the room with, or the energy that you turn your camera on with, is the energy that will follow suit. So we need to be aware of that piece.
Yeah, and I would even suggest think about that as you're structuring your days and your weeks, right? Especially. a few more questions that have popped in here, and we'll see if we can get to them in the time that we have. A question from Heather. Now, for my team, they've all been in the office for the last 18 months as their work cannot be done at home, but they have not been alone as most workers are at home. They are very hesitant to having everyone come back. So I'm getting the picture of some in the office and more returning here. How do I help them feel safe when others may or may not be vaccinated, and so on? So one of the first things I come to here is I think there's some good piece in reminding them how they've managed to get through the past 18 months. Clearly, they've done something well to get there, right? I don't think we're here to really speak to safety measures or anything like that at a workplace, but Jenny, any thoughts around how do you help remind folks of how they are safe in the workplace? Or
it's I don't have an answer. No, I do have an answer. So when the extras, when the rest of the team is coming back in, when we're adding back in again, there's some really interesting dynamics. And so the people who've been there, they couldn't do their job from home, and now they're having to have everybody come back in. We've actually got two cliques happening here. And so as a leader, we've got a really interesting piece. And I think we're right back to, again, listen, and then we need to form those connections again. And this is a really interesting piece because some have learned to form connections virtually. Some have been, just there, and we formed greater connections because we're the people coming to work every day. That's the bond, that's the common bond that's held us together. And so as you welcome people back to sort of come back to our original team all here, how do we build that bond? How do we build those connections? How do we get to know each other again? And it's different. And so we have to make some time for that to build those pieces. The other thing to remember, this isn't exactly tied to the question, but I think it's important. If you have somebody who's joined your team who hasn't been to the office before, and they're coming in and you've got people who have been there, the person who's never been to the office before doesn't even know where the washrooms are, doesn't know where the coffee pot is. And there is a huge difference when somebody welcomes them and shows them those easy pieces so they can just be like, this is hard enough already, let's help them just to be. Then the next bit becomes a bit easier to manage. And it doesn't all have to come from the leader. We can use our peers, peer mentoring, peer support, all those kind of pieces as well. I think awareness is basic.
Yeah, and you left out the big one that always, even when I was in the office every day, is getting that darn photocopier and printer working.
There you go. Yeah.
Oh, man. Okay, one last question I'm going to take here, and then we can kind of wrap up. And so basically, our upper leadership clearly wants everyone back, but I can think of a case to make to keep my team at home. But I'm worried about the optics for my team and myself. So the question here is, should I even try to push for flexibility for my team if it is against the culture? I may reframe that a little bit to say, how should I push? Because I don't think it's, without knowing more around the context, whether we can or should answer whether you should or shouldn't, but I think we could perhaps talk about how you can try and push for that flexibility.
Okay, for once, I will practice what I preach. We won't shit on anybody. So first off, what does the team want? And in your real heart of hearts, is that what you want to? So that's the first piece. You got to be absolutely crystal clear on that, because if it's not a whole decision, do you want to take on that conversation, that battle, that push, whatever it might be? The optics piece is an interesting one, but optics often gets skewed when we're not telling the full story. So how's the communication working on that? If this team just magically gets to stay home and do what they want and nobody else gets a choice, yeah, those optics are gross. However, if there's good communication around that and understanding, that's the piece too. We live in the world of experiments. So what happens if we try this for X number of months and then we revisit it, but we revisit it from our team as stakeholders, our upper management, our senior management, our productivity, our results. And I don't know the ins and outs, that depends who and what you do, but how does that work? And could it be an experiment?
It's an interesting approach. You have a great phrase, and that's about changing the conversation if you're not liking the conversation that you're in right now. And I think that whole piece around, maybe repositioning it as a trial or as an experiment, I think is a really, really brilliant one. That's good. And April has an interesting comment here in the chat, and that's, in that the team's being directed to move hybrid, mostly at home, hotel offices only. It's the reverse. The optics are that we're no longer valued and not wanted back in the office, I think is what I'm taking from that comment, April. So kind of the flip side of this, right? It just goes to show that there's so many angles to what we're going to experience over the next little bit. And I think leaders also need to be prepared. If you are bringing groups back en masse in September, you may have a bit of a productivity slump, right? If you have teams that have not been together, there's going to be that inevitable reconnection. There's going to be inevitable far more time spent around the coffee maker or in the hallway discussion or at the water cooler, or hey, let's go grab lunch. I think we're going to see a productivity slump in the short term before things spin back, right? It's going to be really challenging for that to happen. So we're a little bit over time, Jenny, so maybe we could probably take a look at wrapping up with, as we usually do, a big idea, a couple strategies, and 3 questions for folks to consider. Questions, comments that we didn't get to, because there's a number in the chat that we'll make sure we pull out and put in the follow-up material. So I don't want to diminish the effort that folks have put in here, but we'll just, in the interest of time, move on here.
We'll do that for sure. So as always, one big idea, 2 things to take away and some questions to contemplate. This one, it seems a bit obvious, but I think we need the reminder: control the controllables. And we've spoken about them today. Your energy and your mindset is a really good place for you to start. You are in 100% control of that. How you approach the conversation, how you show up, how you take care of yourself. And reminding your teams too, we waste a lot of energy on things that we just can't control. And so bring that back into what is within our control. Our first takeaway today, we've mentioned this a few times too, is that we need to listen. And the sort of first 2 are pretty obvious. What's your medium? I don't see my people at the moment. Well, you can see them if you turn your cameras on and make some one-on-one time, and you can listen. But I think the most important piece there is that 3rd bullet point on who are you listening to. And so when we dig into listening, there's probably 3 clearest levels. So if we're in a conversation, it's possible I'm only listening for the sake of me. So I'm really paying attention to me and what I need and what I want. The other side of it is I'm only listening to you. And so now I'm just kind of sort of hearing your side and your need. And what we really want to get to is that true listening, which is where we've got the whole bubble going on. And that's you and me, all the stuff that's in between that's not being said, and what's within that relational sort of space in there as well. So listening is something that we constantly need to keep working on, and make the time for it as well. The other one we have for taking away, and we have mentioned this, that piece around boundaries. And I think that this is really difficult, but it's self-care. Self-care isn't a spa day. Self-care isn't take a day off. Self-care is everyday work, and that starts with setting up boundaries. So if this is brand new to you, just get people to think about their capacity, and when they sort of get dragged into that negative Nelly downward spiral piece, because that'll show us where we can think about putting boundaries. And then as a leader, have that conversation about boundaries. As I said beforehand, this often gets uncomfortable, but we have to get comfortable with the uncomfortable and have the conversation, figure out what that looks like. And then when we talk about boundaries, we always want to go to, you can start work and finish work at these times. But boundaries covers so much more than that. And so there's a few of them there as well. Physical boundaries with our new distancing space. What does that look like? Emotional boundaries. Where will we have those guardrails? And a good conversation is, what will it look like? if we need to put that in place, if we need to remind people. And then questions to leave with, say, this was hard. I played with these a lot. I settled on these in the end because I think they're doable. I often like to leave it hanging out there, but I think we need sort of things that we can do that are in our grasp. So where can you hit pause today? Remember, there's that noise in your head, there's noise in your world, and there's a space in between. Find that space just for a minute or 2 minutes. And as you said in your acronym at the beginning, breathe. It makes all the difference in the world. And then start to think about, what environment does your team need? You don't know the answer to that question unless you're asking your team to. So that's kind of a shared question there. And then what's your self-check? And so you guys can't see it, but there are Post-its everywhere in this office. It's kind of set up so that you don't see them. And they're all self-checks. And it just reminds me, how am I showing up? Who am I showing up for? We're back to that roles and strengths piece as well.
Perfect. No, that's great. Actually, you just reminded me, there was a great Adam Grant post about the whole Zoom world, right? He shows the picture of what people are actually seeing, and then off to the side is just the mess in the office, right? And so, not saying you've got a messy office, but the Post-its are great. So, folks, I want to thank you. This is the end of our summer series. We will be back September 17th. We have the opportunity. Sorry, back up one slide, please, Jenny. There are a number of courses that are coming up at SAIT. Please feel free to take a look at our continuing education professional studies website, Leaders as Coaches, Communicating Effectively. We're back in September. There's a number of courses there available. Jenny and I will be back September 17th. Lots of changes will have occurred by then. But we'll be back to talk about the 6 intelligences of leadership. We're excited about this. You'll see some messages from us coming out over the next few weeks, prepping folks for that. I want to thank everybody who's joined us week after week. I know we have closed in probably now close to, over this entire time, close to 1,800 registrants, which has kind of blown my mind a little bit. And so thank you for those who have been with us for multiple times and those who joined us for the first time today. And with that, have a great remainder of your summer. Best of luck with the transition back in September, and we'll see you all very soon. Take care.
We will. Have a good summer. Thanks so much, everybody.
Bye-bye.